Under Roman numeral 2, concerning actions. Misrepresentation was large letter A. We'll start large letter B this morning. Large letter A, misrepresentation. Large letter B, pretension. Pretension. Now, I can't remember exactly what it was that caused me to make this distinction or this division, because I think these things could easily be lumped together. Probably if you're misrepresenting someone or something else, you're pretending as though something is when it isn't. So easily I think the case could be made that misrepresentation is the same as pretension. But I think also a case could be made that there's a slight distinction between the two terms. So although some overlapping is certain to take place, don't let that bother you. In other words, scriptures or cases we cover under pretension might could have been covered under misrepresentation and vice versa. But they still fit here, not under Roman numeral 1 or 3 or 4, but under Roman numeral 2 concerning actions that are taken. Okay, top of page 24, back to the paper. Seems like a long time ago. I know it's only a couple of weeks since we were here on this subject. Top of page 24. We only go to 38, remember, so we don't have far to go. As intimated previously, a certain degree of overlapping between the areas of misrepresentation and pretension is unavoidable. To misrepresent yourself is to perhaps pretend to be something which you are not. Peremptoriness over where each text should properly be placed out of the way, let us again journey into Scripture to, number 1, briefly mention 2 texts of little consequence, problematically speaking, and number 2, elucidate 2 other passages which are somewhat on the complicated side. So, shorthand for that is 2 easy passages, 2 difficult ones. We're going to look at the 2 easies. We're going to get started into the first difficult and see how far we go. And the first difficult is really not that difficult. So we have 2 easy, 1 semi, and then 1 very difficult one. Okay, 2 easy ones. Acts chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. These are easy ones. You'll know right away what we're talking about when you see these passages. Or especially this first of the easy ones. Acts 5, verses 1 to 11. Case of Ananias and Sapphira. Now, a man named, and really this has to be connected with those last verses of chapter 4, because we've seen how freely they're surrendering their goods, even to the point of selling property, verses 36 and 37. Barnabas doing this and bringing the money and laying it at the apostles' feet. So that's really connected now with what we have in 5, kind of a poor chapter division here. Now, a man named Ananias, together with his wife Sapphira, also sold a piece of property. Also means it's connected to something else. Well, it's connected to Barnabas selling a piece of property, so it's a poor chapter division. With his wife's full knowledge, he kept back part of the money for himself, but brought the rest and put it at the apostles' feet. Now, you think there's anything wrong with that? Have you ever, with your wife's full knowledge, not given all that you could have given? Well, there's nothing wrong with that, is there? We tend to think there is something wrong. Well, there will be something wrong as it's pointed out, starting with verse 3. But if all we had were the first 2 verses, there's nothing wrong with keeping back part of the price of the sale of the property with your wife's full knowledge and your cousins and your uncles. It doesn't matter who knows it. But he seems to be pretending that he's giving more than he really is. That seems to be the problem. So we have Ananias and Sapphira who own a piece of property somewhere, and they sell it, just like Barnabas did. They sell it. They get money for it. They're going to come and give some of the money to the fledgling church here. Then Peter said, Ananias, how is it that Satan has so filled your heart that you have lied to the Holy Spirit and have kept for yourself some of the money you received for the land? Now, as Peter's going to point out in the next verse, there was nothing wrong with keeping some of the money for himself. There was only something wrong with pretending that he gave more than he really did. They, as Peter will point out, were perfectly within their rights to sell the property and keep all the money. Give all of it. Give half. Give 3/4. Give 1/4. But they never had the right to get any amount of money and imply that they had really given more. He said, to do that, you've lied to the Holy Spirit. And we know what it cost them to do that. This fourth verse is an interesting one. It'll be an interesting one later in ethics because it certainly teaches the right of private ownership. Didn't it belong to you before it was sold? And after it was sold, didn't the money belong to you? Whether it was sold or it was turned into money. You have the right of private ownership. That property was yours. It doesn't belong to the church. You don't have to give it to the church. The money is yours. Doesn't belong to the church. You don't have to give it to the church. But watch out when you start giving it, though. Be sure you don't pretend that you're giving more than you really are. What made you think of doing such a thing? You have not lied to men, but to God. You see, nowhere in this passage are we told what I'm telling you now. You have to get that out by implication. Nowhere are we told really what's going on here. I think most of us already know because we know the passage. But you might not have known prior to someone telling you what was taking place here because we're not told anything. We're not told that they pretended to give more than they really did. But that obviously is the clear implication of the passage. You have not lied to men, but to God. When Ananias heard this, he fell down and died, and great fear seized all who heard what had happened. And the young men came forward and wrapped up his body and carried him out and buried him. And about 3 hours later, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. And Peter asked her, tell me, is this the price you and Ananias got for the land? Now, she's going to tell an outright lie here. Is this the price? Yes, she said, this is the price. Now we know from this passage what they've been implying, because she comes out and tells it. They didn't give 3/4. Is this the price you got for the land? They were implying they sold the property and gave the whole amount of money to the apostles. That's what they're implying. Peter said to her, how could you agree to test the Spirit of the Lord? Look, the feet of the men who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out also. At that moment she fell down at his feet and died. Then the young men came in, and finding her dead, they just about finished that first burying process, carried her out and buried her beside her husband, and great fear, and no wonder why either, seized the whole church and all who heard about these events. It was a dangerous thing to do, to lie to the Holy Spirit. Now here's a lie. Now Sapphira tells a lie. But to begin with, she and Ananias must have acted out a lie by actions. We had property and here's the money. You can just picture what they're saying. They didn't have to come out and say, here's all of the money. Just in their actions, we've sold some property and here's the money. Well, I would take from that, here's all of the money. If that's the way you said it, here's the money. You should have said, here's some of the money, here's part of the money. The apostles would have accepted that. They weren't under any obligation to give all. But they were under the obligation to be truthful in whatever they did. So we see how important truthfulness is here. They're under the obligation to be truthful, whether they give some, none, all. They have to be truthful. And of course they're not. Well, the obvious implication of Acts 5, 1-11 is that Ananias and Sapphira pretended by their actions to have given all of the money from the sale of their property. The apostolic commentary upon their action revolved not around their penuriousness, but around their deceit. For Peter, in other words, not around the fact they only gave a little and kept some. That wasn't Peter's problem at all. His problem was their deceit. For Peter cried out, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit? Thus we see that pretension by word or deed is categorically denounced as deceit. Pretension by word or deed, they do both of them here. Pretension by word or deed is categorically denounced as deceit. It's just as much a pure form of lying as calling black white and white black. It is purely a lie, and God will hold us accountable for that. Okay, the second passage is in the Old Testament, 1 Samuel 19:13. Now, if this causes anyone a few problems, just raise your hand, let me know or something, and we'll come back to it later. We may come back to it anyway. But I don't really want to go into it a lot this morning. 1 Samuel 19:13. You'll see what I mean when you get there. It kind of seems to, for some people, it's going to fit back there with Rahab and the hiding of the two men in the well. Because it does get back to the area of persecution and fleeing from one's enemies and all of that, where we don't have that in Acts 5. We have a different case there entirely. But here we certainly do have the same case of persecution, of authorities sending out people to have other people killed, and people trying to hide and escape and get away. And I think we probably still need to work out a little more of our theology of persecution and Christian strategy and escape, just what is allowed and what isn't. But since I'm obviously covering this under pretension, I must not be in agreement with the method that's used. Let's start with verse 9. An evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. While David was playing the harp, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night David made good his escape. So there's the context. And Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, "If you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed." So Michal let David down through a window, kind of like what happened to the Apostle Paul, and he fled and escaped. Do we see anything wrong with that yet then? I think we agreed that would be acceptable. Then she took an idol, of all things, she took one of her household idols here. She took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair on the head. When Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, "He's ill." And Saul sent the men back, saying, "Well, bring the bed and all, and I'll kill him." And when the men entered, there was an idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. Saul said to Michal, "Why'd you deceive me? It's really to your own harm that this is going to happen." Well, do you have any problems with that being deceit there? I classify that as deceit as being wrong. I classify that differently than what we did with Rahab, what we did with the two women in the well. And if we have to discuss that more, believe me, we will come back to that. We will be back to that. And I think you can find other cases like that. But there's a classic scriptural text for what you see in the movies and hear about all the time. Putting some dummy in the bed and pretending as though it's David there. Of course, it really serves no purpose. David's already gone. The king's not going to get him. Saul can't touch him. So it's really ridiculous that she does it. Even if we argue, well, she's trying to win more time for him, because it took time for the messengers to come and wait and then go back to the king and report Michal's statement he's ill, and then come back and bring David and the bed and find out that it's really an idol, teraphim there with some goat's hair. But he didn't need any time. David knew all of the haunts of the Judean hillside by this time, and he had many places to hide. Saul wasn't going to get him because God was protecting him anyway. And it is interesting that Michal, of all things, uses an idol. That kind of alerts me to the fact something's going to be wrong in this method of strategy here. Okay, now let's come to, under pretension, one of the larger texts in Acts chapter 17. As you know, here under pretension, we only have two big ones that we're going to look at, and this one's going to be fairly easy to discuss. What makes me place it, first of all, under the ones somewhat on the complicated side, as I say there in the first paragraph on the top of page 24, are the textual problems that we have. Now, if you will, if you've got your KJV with you, that's what we want to use. You can leave your NIV open. We'll take a look at it later. If you got your KJV with you, you have to use that, or we don't have any problem then. We've got to start with the KJV to discuss this passage. Acts 17, about the first 20 verses or so. Now, we're probably going to also need a little geography and some other things to get the full case of what's going on. Let me see if I can draw some of this up here then. Let's see. Verse 1, down through 15. Verse 1 down through 15. Okay, Paul's on his, this must be the second journey that he takes, second apostolic or missionary journey or trip that he makes. He's up in northern Greece, verse 1. He passed through Amphipolis, Apollonia, comes to Thessalonica, then he goes to Berea, and then he goes to Athens down in verse 16. So let's give ourselves some geography here. We give ourselves, this is just Greece, we give ourselves Athens here, Thessalonica here, Berea here. Verse 2, Paul, as his manner was, went unto them 3 Sabbath days, reasoned with them out of the Scriptures, opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen again from the dead, and that this Jesus whom I preach to you is Christ. And some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. But the Jews which believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and gathered a company, and set all the city on an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. When they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, the politarchs, Luke said, crying, these that have turned the world upside down have come hither also, whom Jason hath received. These all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus. They troubled the people and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. When they had taken security or taken a pledge, probably a financial pledge of Jason and of the other, they let them go. The brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night unto Berea, who coming thither went into the synagogue of the Jews. And these were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind, and searched the Scriptures daily, whether those things were so. Therefore many of them believed, also of honorable women, which were Greeks, and of men not a few. So first step is here is by night we have a journey of Paul and some of the men sending him over to Berea. Verse 13, but when the Jews of Thessalonica had knowledge that the word of God was preached of Paul at Berea, they came thither also and stirred up the people. And then immediately the brethren sent away Paul. Now, how many of you have your KJV with you this morning? Good. Sent away Paul to go, as it were, to the sea. But Silas and Timotheus abode there still. And they that conducted Paul brought him unto Athens. And receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timotheus for to come to him with all speed, they departed. All right, verse 14 now. The middle of that verse is our problem here. Then immediately the brethren sent away Paul to go, as it were, to the sea. You see how there's just minor things here in the Bible that give a lot of people a lot of problems. To go as it were. Well, what do we mean as it were? Like, well, as it were, going over to the sea, or as it were to the sea, but then really he's not going to the sea. So here's the problem. We've got a couple of ports like Diem and some other ports right along here. They sent him in this direction to go as it were to the sea. Now he's got persecutors behind him. The Jews at Thessalonica followed him from there all the way over to Berea. They're obviously going to continue to follow him wherever he goes. And so the brethren send him away as it were to the sea. Now here's Athens down here. How does he get there? By land or by sea? Did they send him as it were to the sea? And so we would think this route, and therefore his persecutors would think that route, but they doubled back on them and really went by land down here to Athens. Or did they go as it were to the sea, over to the sea, as it were to the sea? It can mean two different things here. And therefore they went truly by the sea, and either went this way or other maps could give it that way. So, it presents a big problem because again, it appears like strategy is involved. It's in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul is using it. Persecution is our context. Fleeing from one's enemies is our context. Therefore, is it allowed whenever you flee from your enemies to go in one direction, make them think you're going in that direction, backtrack real quickly, and go in another direction? Now, if you've ever watched a Davy Crockett or Daniel Boone movie, I'm sure you're familiar with this. How you go forward and then you back up and put your feet in the same, and then you jump up on a log, and then you jump up on a stone and climb through a few trees, so there's no footpath that leads off of your path. Then you jump down to the ground and take off. Now, we know foxes will do things like that, but those are animals. They're not morally responsible. Foxes will elude hunters and dogs just incredibly. They are incredibly bright. Are we humans allowed to do such things? A Lucan passage, Acts 17:14, from Paul's ministry, must be studied separately from the above two texts only because it is more involved. To understand the potential problems and solutions, we will first have to know something of the geography, which we've tried to draw for you up here. The chapter begins with Paul arriving at Thessalonica. After a stay of indeterminate time, certainly over 3 weeks so, C.D. Edmund Hebert, The Thessalonian Epistles, Chicago Moody Press, 1971, pages 16 and 17, and that comment is due to that phrase found in the middle of verse 2. He is forced out, but it's another question of Paul's ministry, and his itinerary doesn't affect this. He's forced out to Berea here, only to have the Thessalonian Jews come and also force him out of this city, verses 10 and 13. It is at the point of verse 14 that a problem confronts us. Did Paul and company try to trick their assumed pursuers, as the KJV seems to imply, by pretending to go by sea only to double back and travel to Athens by land? So you have to know this geography to know what's taking place here. That's essential and crucial to know what's taking place. Okay, let me see if I can put something on the overhead and you can still see both of those. I'll move it up here in a moment. Here's what we have as far as our textual evidence is concerned. And of course we need this because we do have a textual problem with this verse. Now if we didn't have a textual problem, I hope you can see that because I don't want to have to draw all of that again. Maybe I can move it over. You can read it better over there. If we don't have a textual problem, then we just have to deal with it as it's stated. We've got to look at the evidence, look at the support of the manuscripts and the translations and the commentators and the Greek editors of the New Testament, and then make our decision accordingly. Now, first of all, we have our Byzantine reading, Hosipitein Thalason, which I've written in Greek and then transliterated for you. Hosipitein Thalason, the Byzantine reading, which is a reading adopted by KJV. That would mean as to the sea, or as if to the sea, or as it were to the sea. All depends on these first small words that we have. Thalason, the sea or lake, the Greek word for that, it's always the same. As to the sea, as if to the sea, or as it were to the sea, which is what they've given us in the KJV, as it were to the sea. That's the Byzantine reading. Then secondly, we have our Western reading, Epitein Thalason, which simply means to the sea. To the sea. They went to the sea. Still doesn't tell us which way he traveled, but it doesn't plant in our mind that thought that maybe he's trying to trick his pursuers by as it were, or as if to the sea. He pretended to go to the sea, just to the sea. Western reading, Epitein Thalason, just to the sea. Then we have, thirdly, our Alexandrian reading. Our Alexandrian reading, Hosepitane Thalasan. You have all of it on there except missing an N over there, I guess, on Thalasan, which of course means as far as to the sea. They went as far as to the sea. Now see, some of these verses we don't have textual problems with, so we have to discuss them from another point of view entirely. But if we have textual problems, we always like to deal with those first. That's always what you do first. Because before you can come up with your interpretation of the passage, you have to have the correct text before you. So we have to know what text we're going to adopt. Byzantine as if to the sea, Western to the sea, Alexandrian as far as to the sea. Now, of course, the Byzantine reading is supported by the vast majority of the manuscripts. But the vast majority of the manuscripts are also late. Western is supported by a few Western texts. Alexandrian, supported by the following manuscripts: by Aleph, A, B, E. That gives us Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and Vaticanus right in a row. Then getting into Numbers 33, 81, 104, 181, 945. Of course, we get up into some later ones here. 1739. Supported by the Vulgate, by the Syriac, by the Peshitta, and by the editors Tischendorf and Westcott and Hort. They all support Alexandrian reading. H.A.W. Meyer opts for Byzantine, Meyer's New Testament commentary. Most of the commentators take a non-Byzantine reading, however. They take a non-as if to, or as it were, as to the sea. Most commentators take a non-Byzantine reading. I'm back to reading part of my paper as well, stating that no pretense was involved and that Paul traveled by sea. We could take either Western or Alexandrian. Paul went to the sea, Paul went as far as to the sea, got in a boat, and traveled to Athens. They take a non-Byzantine reading, stating that no pretense was involved, and that Paul did in fact travel by sea. Those commentators being Cook, J.F.B., Pulpit, Robertson. This was more needful for my paper maybe than it is for you. Nicole, Barnes, you have all of that already, and Henry Alford. Cook, J.F.B., Pulpit, Robertson, Nicole, Barnes, and Alford. Although, I continue in this sentence, although Chrysostom kept the Byzantine, which was the host's reading. Well, we don't have it, it's gone on the top. Chrysostom kept the Byzantine reading, the host, as if to the sea, but he found no deceit.
For the continuation of
Byzantine reading, the host, as if to the sea, but he found no deceit. Okay, now here's the support for all that. H.A.W. Meyer, Commentary on the New Testament, Peabody, Massachusetts, Hendrickson Publishers, Incorporated, reprint 1983, Volume 4, page 327. Cook, The Bible Commentary, Volume 8, page 469. Jameson, Fawcett, Brown, A Commentary, Critical, Experimental, and Practical, Grand Rapids, William B. Erdman's Publishing Company, reprint, 1978, Volume 3, page 124. H.C. Hervey, The Pulpit Commentary, Acts, McLean, Virginia, McDonald Publishing Company, no date, Volume 18, page 59. A.T. Robertson, Word Pictures of the New Testament, Grand Rapids, Baker Bookhouse, 1930. Someone is saying, Volume 3, page 376. W. Robertson, Nicole, The Expositors, Greek Testament, Grand Rapids, William B. Erdman's Publishing Company, reprint, 1980, Volume 2, page 363. Albert Barnes, Barnes Notes, Grand Rapids, Baker Bookhouse, reprint, 1983, Volume 10, page 255. Henry Alford, New Testament for English Readers, Grand Rapids, Baker Bookhouse, reprint, 1983, Volume 2, page 768. Chrysostom, the Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers, Homilies on Acts, Grand Rapids, William B. Erdman's Publishing Company, reprint, 1980, Volume 11, page 230. You can applaud if you want to. Then Meyer Meyer states in a footnote that among those who find deceit practiced here, it was approved of God, as if to the sea. And these are Beza, Bingle, Neander, and Lang. Meyer, Commentary on the New Testament, Volume 4, page 329, C, Note 9. The noted evangelical scholar F.F. Bruce also leans toward this view, although he does mention the other parenthetically. F.F. Bruce, The New International Commentary on the New Testament, Grand Rapids, William B. Erdman's Publishing Company, reprint, 1981, Volume 5, page 347. In other words, Bruce does believe that it was as it were to the sea, as if to the sea, as to the sea, and that deceit was practiced here, and that this form of deceit was approved of God. It was allowed of God. Without determining the correct reading right now, we'll come to that here in a moment, there does exist another possible alternative to help us see whether or not Paul attempted to trick his persecutors. Someone says, well, I don't know about all the readings and the manuscripts and Byzantine and Western. Well, there's another way we can attempt to get in this house, another door through which we can attempt to enter. I'm not saying it'll be successful, but we can attempt to enter this door. And that would be, obviously, to ask the question, well, in what manner did Paul go? Regardless of the reading, whether it was as it were to the sea or as far as to the sea, how did he get to Athens? Did he go by land or did he go by sea? If you've got a Bible with maps in it, let's see what they say back here. Be interesting because I don't see where it said in those verses. Doesn't say that he finally got off the boat in Athens. It just says, next thing you know, he's in Athens. Well, with my KJV, what do I have here? We're on second journey. Some of you have a Bible like mine. That would be a solid red line. Berea. Looks like he went by sea there, doesn't it? Went by sea, and he went, where's my island? Here's my island. Went between the island and the land. There we go that way. Let's see what the NIV Bible has with some around the island, but he goes by sea. Okay, that's a solid blue line. Yeah, he goes way around the island, and then he comes up to Athens. Neither one of those give it to us by land, then. That's interesting. So we certainly have it. We have it this way, then, all the way around and back up here. Did Paul travel to Athens by land or sea? If he traveled by sea, then he did nothing contrary to his actions in heading in that direction. Doesn't matter what reading we want to adopt. It can be as it were to the sea, doesn't matter what reading. If he actually went by sea, that's where he was headed. His persecutors would have followed him right to the sea. So if he did go by sea, then it doesn't matter what reading we are going to adopt or accept here. Our problem is no problem because it now has a solution. If by land, even that does not necessarily imply deceit on his part. And here's several reasons why. It could have been that no boats were available at the ports. So he just simply traveled down here to sea, in his mind intending to go by sea, not thinking he's going to trick anyone. But he gets down here to the ports, and there's no boats that are heading out at that time to Athens, so he says, all right, I'll change my plans, and I'll simply go by land. Now, that might have tricked his persecutors who saw him headed toward the sea. They get there later and think that he left in a boat. Of course, they can ask around and find out no boats have left anytime recently. So we're saying it doesn't matter whether he went by sea or land. It doesn't necessarily imply to sea. See, a lot depends on what's going on in Paul's mind right now. If by land, not necessarily deceit because perhaps no boats were available. Maybe he discovered a walk by the coastal route more to his liking. He intended to go by sea, and he got down there, and it's a nice day and pretty weather. Well, I think I'll walk. Since we obviously do not know of a certainty all of what happened, it would be dangerous and semi-ludicrous to build a doctrine of deceit on such flimsy evidence as Acts 7 and verse 14. You see, F. Bruce, who's a noted evangelical scholar, believes that Paul did intend to deceive his persecutors and that God allowed this. Well, I don't know that we could say that no matter what reading we take here. We just don't know what was going on. When it said, as it were to the sea, other things could have changed his mind by the time he got there. And therefore no deceit would be necessary. Here's another point, though. Because of Luke's normal custom in writing of a sailing expedition, his normal custom in writing of a sailing expedition is to note the point of embarkation, and no port is mentioned here, such as Methone or Dium, these two little ports that I've drawn for you. Harrison has suggested a land trip based on such evidence as Acts 13, verses 4 and 13, chapter 14, verses 25 and 26, chapter 16, and verse 11, chapter 18, chapter 20, and verse 6. Everett Harrison, Acts Expanding Church, Chicago, Moody Press, 1975, page 265. Now, in other words, the point that I'm making here, or that Harrison is making here, is that Luke's practice, if he ever is going to mention someone getting in a boat and sailing, he always mentions the port of embarkation. He always mentions the port at which they get on a boat and take off. And here, no port is mentioned at all. And I gave you all those references. Whenever he talks about someone sailing, he has a certain practice that he follows. Whenever he talks about someone sailing, he mentions the port that the boat leaves from. No port's mentioned here. It would have to be either Methone or Dium, one or the other. Those are the only two ports there. And he mentions no port at all. So that's contrary to Luke's normal custom. In other words, the implication would almost be that Luke is trying to tell us that he went by land instead of by sea, since he breaks his regular practice. Harrison agrees with the Alexandrian text. He went as far as to the sea, but assumes that Paul did something contrary to what his adversaries had suspected. So again, he practices deceit, and Harrison doesn't tell us, I suppose, here whether it's allowed of God or not. So, what are we going to say about that? This is not one we're going to argue over because there's too much other information that you wouldn't know. All this textual stuff and geography and the practice of Luke in writing Acts. That's why I'm discussing it from the point of view of the paper. However, even when taking into consideration Luke's normal practice, pointed out by Harrison, several thoughts seem to weaken the land trip hypothesis. Now, are you with me thus far? How it seems like he's this way and then this way and then this way? It seems like since Luke breaks his normal custom of giving us the port from which the ship leaves or the boat leaves, that he means for us to understand that Paul went by land. That's what Harrison wants us to understand. My argument then would be, well, it's several-fold argument, that even though Luke does break his normal practice, I think we have some other thoughts to think about which would weaken the land trip hypothesis. Number one, it was much easier to overtake someone on foot or mule by land, for all traveled on the same roads. Here, presumably, a coastal route. In other words, you don't have 15 roads to go from one of these ports down to Athens. You only have one main road. And it's probably some coastal road that runs along the coast here. Whether Paul's walking or whether Paul is on some animal, it's very easy to catch someone. If you're out in the sea, you're out in the big blue ocean there. Boats could be, a couple of miles from you and you couldn't even see them. But if everyone has to travel on the same road here, and it'd be too easy for them to be overtaken. Another point under this first point here is the fact that there is a mountain chain right through here. It's not like this is going to be an easy walk for the Apostle Paul. He's got to cross a mountain chain, and there are other small mountains over which he will be going. And there's going to only be one way, one road from these coastal towns here, Methuen and Dium, all the way down to Athens. Then a second argument of mine against this land trip hypothesis is the following. A land journey would have been unnecessarily long, perhaps 250 miles, whereas a trip by boat with favorable winds would have taken only a few days. Now, how long is it going to take you to walk 250 miles? A month? I mean, you don't make very many miles a day, especially not if you're climbing any mountains, especially not if you're the Apostle Paul who's been beaten and shipwrecked and everything else. 250 miles? And you can only make just a few miles a day? Well, maybe a month. He could have made it in a boat with favorable winds in a couple of days. Seems that Paul wouldn't have wasted all of that time, a whole month, walking by foot to get to Athens. Hence, it is impossible to be certain what type of trip Paul took. But because the Alexandrian text is to be followed, the Greek New Testament, 3rd edition corrected, UBS 1983, page 485, this rules out any possibility for deception on Paul's part. So you see, we tried to get in through another door and just look at the geography and ask ourselves, well, what does Luke tell us about his trip down there? How did he get there? If he went by sea, no problem. If he went by land, perhaps no problem. But if we take out the Byzantine reading, as it were, as if, as to the sea, and put in, he went as far as to the sea. He just went down to the sea. He doesn't tell us what happened after that. He went as far as to the sea. Did he stop and then walk? Did he get on a boat and then go? Some of what Luke tells us, his normal practice, seems to imply he didn't go by boat, he went by land. These considerations I'm just giving you tend to imply he wouldn't have gone by land. That would have been dumb. It would have taken too long. He went by boat. The maps, most of the maps that you see, as both of these and these Bibles have pointed out, show that he went by water, although that can't be proven one way or the other, whether he went by land or whether he went by water. Seems to be the case. But regardless of all of that, since the best manuscripts support the Alexandrian reading, that's what we adopt. So, in your KJV, you ought to have stricken out there that as it were, or it were. Let me see exactly what it is I have out. You need to have, he went, to the sea, something on that order. I've got it were to. And I've got written in, then immediately the brethren sent away Paul to go as far as the sea, the Alexandrian reading. They sent away Paul to go as far as the sea. You might have never noticed this little problem here, but some people will spot these things right away and say, now, the apostle practiced some deceit here. Now, the interesting question for us would be, what if as it were to the sea was correct, the correct reading? What if Paul did go down to the sea, knowing his persecutors were thinking he was going by boat, and then he backtracked by land real quickly? What would we think of such maneuvers? Well, you're safe this morning. We don't have time to get into that. And we're going to fit that under another portion of our study where we'll wrap up some of the earlier things that we've said. Now, I don't assume we do have a question.
Yeah, why on his third journey the map shows that he went not only down but up between Athens and Berea?
On his third journey?
Yeah.
Well, he's got to make... Pardon?
It shows he took the land route in the next journey.
The next journey? Well, he does. He does take the land journey. We're certainly told that. There we have a land journey. There we definitely have a land journey there. But we got to consider a lot of other things with Paul's third journey. Whenever he's writing the end of Romans, whenever he's writing the beginning of 2 Corinthians, he tells them how he's had to change his itinerary. 2 Corinthians 1, he said, you're going to get a double blessing. I'll go through you to Macedonia and come back from Macedonia through you. Where earlier he had had an entirely different itinerary plan because he wants to make it to Jerusalem at a certain time. Here, other events have come up, a lot of other things I don't want to get into. We have the so-called severe letter, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 2 that was written. We have the so-called painful visit, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 2. We have lots of other things there that just are way outside the ballpark. But of course we wouldn't say that Paul would be against traveling by land. He travels all over Asia Minor by land, where if he wants to go to Ephesus, he could just drop down here by sea and come up here instead of walking through the Cilician mountains and everything else. So he could certainly do that. But, I mean, his persecutors are after him here. He wants to get to Athens. They're trying to save his life. It wouldn't make sense to me that he's going to just plod along for a month or so by land. They'll catch up with him and kill him. That just doesn't make sense to me. But he certainly could travel that way. But let's put it on another journey. Now, what I was going to say was I would assume we wouldn't have questions this morning on this because it's rather self-explanatory. But you do have an assignment for this week. And it's one that you've all been waiting for. 1 Samuel 16. 1 Samuel 16. We will start discussing that next week. I don't know how far we'll get. We may finish it. But we'll start discussing 1 Samuel 16. I'm on the top of page 27. My first sentence of this paragraph reads, in my opinion, there is no more difficult of a passage that relates to this question of truthfulness in all of the Bible than 1 Samuel 16, verses 1 to 5. So that's your assignment. Work on that, and we'll see who's on what side next week and why. Who's on what side, and more importantly now, why? Whenever we come together next week, how can we explain this 1 Samuel 16 passage? This is the crest. This is the top of the mountain, this passage, as far as I'm concerned. Once we get over the top of that, we'll be sailing smoothly down the other side. Although we're going to come back into some of these other issues, like Michael and the hiding in the well, and what if Paul did use some deceit here? Is that form allowed when you're fleeing from your persecutors? I think we do need to come back to that. So 1 Samuel 16 for everyone.